The 80s were like the awkward teenage years for video games. Arcades were in their prime at the time and where primarily many people would go to play their video games. Sure, home consoles at this point were a thing, and many home consoles had ports of arcade games, but many of them were very poor quality.
Atari pac-man.
This ultimately caused the video game crash of '83 that so many people love to blame on that fucking alien with the weird neck running around Area 51 or some shit, but many more people know about the NES. It's become a pop culture revolution of video games, bringing the industry back from near death. The games were some of the best looking on the market, and on the other side of that, in the mid-2000s, a filmmaker and metalhead known as the Angry Video Game Nerd showed up on YouTube, portrayed by James Rolfe.
Well, I want to make this movie, hopefully, like in the next year or two, and the title is The Confounded Crazy Critters Who Devoured Neurotic Livestock and Couldn't Stop Dying, so they had to carry their own tombstones over their heads.
He showcased old-school NES games as well as his reactions and thoughts on them and talked at length about their difficulty. Since then, of course, many copycats and inspired creators have come up, but that's not important right now. What we're going to talk about today are the difficulties of these games, their design philosophy, and why they were so damn hard. Of course, like I said, the NES came at a time where arcades were in their prime, where the best games were. In fact, it was hard to find an arcade game that was complete dog shit, but they were hard as shit, and that was the point. They were meant to suck down your quarters, as these games were in public and meant to be shared by the public. While it was never out of the question for one guy or girl to stand at the cabinet all day and potentially play the game until it broke, as is the case with games like Pac-Man and Donkey Kong, it generally didn't happen because of the exaggerated difficulty of the games. Don't get me wrong, when it did happen, often it was celebrated. And if you've never been in a room full of people watching over the shoulders of a really good Galaga player, you haven't lived a complete life. But ultimately, these machines were investments, meant for business owners to make money, and that was the game design philosophy of the 80s. Make hard, addictive games that people will want to play over and over until their pizza is ready, or until they master them. So naturally, that's what developers knew, hard games. And when the time for ports came, developers did what they knew. I've covered Castlevania and mentioned many times in that video that it was difficult, but other games that fall into this category are Mega Man, Mario 2, also known as the Lost Levels, and Ninja Gaiden. Of course, a huge chunk of the library was hard, but these are among some of the harder ones. One was even considered so hard we never even saw it here in the States. And I would ask a rhetorical, but why are they so hard here? But we already know. Developers including Nintendo, Konami, and Capcom had made many games, and many of them were hard for those reasons, making money and preventing hogging of the machines. And why fix what's not broken? Well, many reasons obviously. These were games that the developers and the store owners already had all the money they were going to make off of them. Games that people would keep at home and play over and over. There are arguments for the reasons why they kept these difficulties though. They were intended for children who often had way more time on their hands to master these games.
I love the Power Glove. It's so bad.
But also, the NES had very limited space on its cartridges, and they couldn't fit as much game on a cartridge as you can now on a hard drive that's the same size or even smaller. So the games were naturally shorter, often doing things like looping the game again in a sort of second challenge or New Game Plus to increase longevity, and sometimes even increase difficulty on top of that. These reasons culminated a library full of challenge that only the most hardcore of gamers could achieve, and the way they increased this difficulty? By putting a fuck ton of bullshit on the screen. Seriously, look at some of these games' most memorable moments. Shit flying everywhere, insane knockback, impossibly complex patterns. It's absolutely maddening. I beat Castlevania 3 times in October in preparation for that video, and if I still had the live footage of me playing the game, I'd put in the clip of me doing the hallway to the Grim Reaper right now, because that shit was one of the hardest things I have ever had to do. Alright, so full disclaimer, I used cheats to get to this point, just for you. So, I took the cheats off, so we're gonna see how long it takes me to get to the end of the Grim Reaper hallway. You see, the hard part about this is just the amount of garbage being thrown your way. Oh, don't tell me I'm gonna do this first try. Yeah, I did it first try, but as you can see, that is an insane amount of shit that was on the screen there. And to follow it up, look at how much health I took, right? Look at how much health I took now. And then you have one of the hardest boss fights in the game right here. I always stand here in the corner and just... Oh, well, I didn't get it. But as you can see, it is a very hard thing to do. So, there you go. On one hand, I understand, you had to make games have replay value, and I can definitely say Castlevania has that, as well as many other games I've played like Mario 3 and Mega Man 2, and the drive to beat that one level that's kicking your ass is definitely a drive, but is frustration and anger a good drive? Sure, the relief that came over me when I land those last blows to Dracula's spirit and Frankenstein— Fuck you, Frankenstein! Sorry, I have some flashbacks whenever I hear its name now. As I was saying, those last few hits on a final boss are the best feeling in the world, and difficulty of this caliber has made a comeback in games like Dark Souls and The Surge. A reason for this is probably because of that feeling you get when you finally complete something that's real difficult. So, I'm going to say that, to at least some degree, yes, the frustration drive is a valid reason for these calibers of difficulty. Not everyone is going to feel like that completely justifies it, but I do certainly feel like that's a positive, even if it wasn't the intent for most games. But let's also remember that only a handful of NES games ever had save options, with most games having a password capability, if anything at all. So if you want to beat a game, you have limited options. A. Do it in one sitting. B. Leave the console running overnight and hope to God Mom doesn't cut it off or trip over the cord. And C. Cut it off and either enter a password, start from the beginning, or load your save where applicable. On top of this, the arcade game philosophy carried over even more when there were no save options, no passwords, run out of lives, and you start from the beginning. This is probably the most infuriating aspect, and I can't find any excuse why anyone would program a game this way. Again, bringing in Castlevania, it was possible to program a checkpoint. In Castlevania, if you die, you begin at the last door you entered in a level, and if you run out of lives, you start at the beginning of the area. It was possible, so why do so many games just plop you back at the start? Again, this harkens back to game design that I'd argue was already out of date at the time of making some of these games. So considering all of this, what can we do now? These games are worth experiencing, but it takes such a long time to master them to the point where you can beat them without Game Genie or cheat codes, which could take away from the experience depending on who you are. Well, aside from emulators, a lot of third-party consoles released in recent days that can play these games, like the Retron 5, have save states built in. This includes Nintendo's own NES Classic as well. I'd say if you have the chance to play these games on an actual console that has save state capability, that'd be your best option. Save states may also take away from the experience according to the most hardcore of fans, but I'd say if you're like me, an adult with a job and no time to master every game that may strike your fancy, you might want to consider that as an option. Other than that, you don't have many options at your disposal. With all of this said, and for the sake of time, I want to end by saying this. The NES games of the 80s are classics. Some of them are truly the best of their kind. They are like movies. A lot of them are hot garbage. A lot of them have glaring flaws, but when they are good, they're really good and worth revisiting once, twice, or even a decade over. So please, have yourself a nice day and remember to pass the controller to your brother so he can do the hard stuff.